This Friday on the Kermode and Mayo Film Review Show on BBC Radio 5 Live, 2 till 4, our special guest is Steven Spielberg, arguably the most successful filmmaker in the world and one of the few directors, like Hitchcock, whose name alone has box office cachet. Now, Spielberg obviously is coming on the show to talk about Lincoln, his major awards contender. Lincoln is heading the pack at the forthcoming awards season.
Abolishing slavery settles the fate for the millions now in bondage. And unborn millions to come.
It's either the amendment or this Confederate peace. You cannot have both.
Slavery, sir, it's done.
And of course, Spielberg is now most celebrated for films like Saving Private Ryan, Schindler's List, and of course Lincoln, which have a historical backbone. Now, personally, I've always felt that Spielberg was at his best with popcorn entertainment. He made his name with Duel and Jaws. He was the person who gave us the multi-format movie with Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and he still cites his most personal film as E.T. I was always one of those people who felt that War of the Worlds actually had more substance than, say, for example, Munich. But during the course of the interview, which we recorded last Friday down the line from Paris, I found myself doing something which I don't often do with filmmakers. I apologised to Steven Spielberg. Specifically, I apologise for getting it wrong on the subject of AI, the film which I wrongly maligned when it first came out, but I now believe to be his enduring masterpiece. Inspired by Brian Aldiss's story Super Toys Last All Summer Long, AI was a long-standing pet project for director Stanley Kubrick, whose work I admire enormously. I don't always love Kubrick's films, but I always admire them. Kubrick worked for years to get AI, the story of a robot boy, off the ground. In fact, according to popular mythology, at one point, Stanley Kubrick went to a bunch of scientists and said, look, I want you to build me a robot boy to star in my movie. They had a go, they failed, so Kubrick shelved the project. Such a Kubrick thing to do. If I can't build a robot child, I won't make a film about a robot child. Over the years, Spielberg became friends with Kubrick, and Spielberg encouraged Kubrick to make AI, but Kubrick apparently kept saying, you know what? This is probably more of a Spielberg movie than a Kubrick movie. And in the end, when Stanley Kubrick died, leaving AI unmade, it was indeed Spielberg who finally brought it to the screen. And the critics, in general, but myself in particular, were pretty sniffy about it. I first saw AI at a screening in New York, and I have to say, I think I probably went in ready to be disappointed. See, for me, Kubrick and Spielberg were completely different filmmakers. Kubrick, on the one hand, was cold, clinical and calculating in a way which I rather admired. Spielberg, on the other hand, was somewhat schmaltzy and sentimental, something about which I tended to be a little bit sniffy. When I watched AI, I saw a lot of schmaltzy sentimentality. It is a film which plays on your heartstrings. There are also moments in it that were clearly Spielberg tropes. For example, the thread which runs through the story about Pinocchio, the recurrence of the Blue Angel motif, and, most notably, a closing coda which seemed to be taken straight from the Steven Spielberg filmmaking handbook. Interestingly enough, since the film came out, Spielberg has clarified on many occasions that loads of those things which critics like me said were overtly Spielbergian were in fact taken directly from Kubrick's own plans for the film. Now, perhaps because AI wasn't particularly well received by either critics or audiences when it first came out, people have forgotten many of its virtues. Nowadays, if you mention AI, people will say, oh yeah, that's the film in which Haley Joel Osment doesn't blink. They don't talk about its wonderful moving score. They don't talk about the central heartbreaking theme of mother and child. They don't mention the way it takes a fairy tale and puts it into a wonderfully adult context, nor do they talk about the scenes of Baroque horror seen in the flesh fairs. So it was a real surprise to me when years later, having been told to do so by others, I went back and looked again at AI and was amazed by how much the film really worked. It really engaged me. It moved me. It made me cry, which I still think is one of the highest aspirations of cinema. A film that makes you cry is doing something right. So, in the course of the interview with Steven Spielberg, I said, look, I apologise. I reviewed your film, I got it completely wrong. And he said, it's interesting, you're only the second critic to ever apologise to me. The other one was Vincent Canby, who apologised for trashing Close Encounters and then a couple of years later recanted. Now, an apology from Vincent Canby is a much more significant thing than an apology from me, but still, it was nice to be in that kind of company. I love AI, and I got it wrong. My question to you is this. What's the Steven Spielberg movie that is your guilty pleasure? What's the one you love the most that at the time you didn't really get? What's the Spielberg film that you love that's not perhaps part of the great Spielberg canon, but you think really does what cinema at its best should do, let me know.
You are a real boy. At least as real as I've ever made one.